Imagine you are in ancient Greece strolling through the marketplace when suddenly you see a shirtless old man squatting in a giant clay jar, eating with his hands, yelling at people for owning too many sandals, and telling the richest man in the world to get out of his sunlight. You would probably think, wow, that man is having a full mental breakdown. But here is the twist. That was Diogenes the Cynic, and far from being a lunatic, he was one of the sharpest minds in history, who dedicated his life to exposing the absurdity of social conventions by refusing to play along with them. He was like a stand-up comedian, a philosopher, and a reality TV disaster rolled into one, except instead of going on Netflix, he made the streets of Athens his stage, and his philosophy was so savage that even Alexander the Great, a man who conquered most of the known world, was humbled by him. Diogenes was born in Sinope, a Greek city on the Black Sea, and he got into philosophy in the most Diogenes way possible, through scandal. His father was a banker, and somehow Diogenes ended up accused of defacing the currency, literally stamping coins with the wrong designs. Instead of doing the sensible thing and hiding from public shame, Diogenes decided that since society was already fake, he might as well go all in and destroy not just coins but the entire value system behind them. He packed up, moved to Athens, and studied under Antisthenes, who had been a student of Socrates. Antisthenes taught a philosophy called Cynicism, which in those days did not mean sitting at home saying everything is terrible while scrolling social media, but instead meant living with radical simplicity, rejecting luxury, and telling the truth so bluntly it could give you a nosebleed. But Diogenes took this to Olympic levels. If Antisthenes was like, you should own less, Diogenes was like, cool, I will own nothing, not even a house, not even a proper bowl to drink from. And he did not just talk about rejecting materialism, he lived it so aggressively that he made monks look like they were shopping at Gucci. His home was a giant ceramic storage jar, the kind they used for grain or wine, parked somewhere in the marketplace. His furniture was the floor. His kitchen was his hands. Once he saw a boy drinking water from his cupped hands, so he threw away his wooden cup, saying, "A child has beaten me in simplicity." If IKEA had tried to sell Diogenes furniture, he would have just laughed and then used the catalog as toilet paper. But this was not just some weird stunt for attention. Diogenes believed that most of human suffering came from pointless social rules and fake needs that we invented for ourselves. People wore fancy clothes, built giant houses, hoarded gold, and obsessed over reputation, and in the process, they forgot how to be genuinely free. He saw society as a costume party where everyone was pretending, so he showed up naked, metaphorically and sometimes literally, to remind them how ridiculous it was. And because he lived without possessions, he was untouchable. You could not bribe him, you could not threaten to take away what he owned, because he had nothing to lose. That made him incredibly dangerous in a world where power usually came from controlling resources. And then there was his absolute mastery of public trolling. Diogenes turned being annoying into an art form. If you asked him for advice, he might insult you. If you asked him for philosophy, he might point to a dog licking itself and say, "There, that is your answer." He famously wandered around Athens in broad daylight carrying a lantern saying, "I am looking for an honest man," implying that he could not find one. It was the ancient equivalent of holding a "still waiting for politicians to keep their promises" sign in Times Square. He once interrupted Plato's lectures by bringing in a plucked chicken and saying, "Here is Plato's human," after Plato defined man as a featherless biped. Plato had to change the definition to featherless biped with broad nails. Yes, Diogenes literally bullied one of the greatest philosophers of all time into editing his dictionary entry. And then came his most legendary moment, the day Alexander the Great met him. Imagine the most powerful man alive, fresh from conquering Persia, rolling into town and wanting to meet this famous homeless philosopher. Alexander finds Diogenes sunbathing, lying on the ground like a contented cat. Alexander says, "I am Alexander the Great." Diogenes does not even sit up. He just says, "I am Diogenes the dog." Alexander, probably expecting flattery, asks if there is anything he can do for him. Diogenes replies, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." That is it. No groveling, no asking for gold, just, "You are blocking my tan." According to legend, Alexander later told his friends, "If I were not Alexander, I would be Diogenes." And that right there is the punchline of his whole life. When the man who owns the world meets the man who needs nothing, the one with nothing wins. Now you might be thinking, cool story, but what does a half-naked man in a jar have to do with my life? Well, more than you think. Diogenes was basically the original life coach, but instead of charging you $1,000 for a seminar, he would yell at you in the street for free. His message was simple. If you want to be free, stop chaining yourself to things that do not matter. The more you need to feel happy, the easier it is for life to take that happiness away. If your joy depends on a certain car, a certain job title, or the number of likes on your posts, then you are a prisoner. But if you can be content with very little, you are unstoppable. Modern psychology backs this up. Studies on hedonic adaptation show that humans quickly get used to new luxuries, so that sports car or expensive handbag only gives you a temporary buzz. Meanwhile, research on minimalism and voluntary simplicity shows that people who focus on relationships, experiences, and personal growth instead of stuff tend to report higher life satisfaction. Basically, science is saying what Diogenes said 2,300 years ago, but with more graphs and fewer chicken-related insults. Another lesson from Diogenes is to question social conventions. We often follow rules not because they make sense, but because everyone else is following them. It is like standing in a line without knowing what it is for, and then realizing you just wasted 20 minutes for a free sample of toothpaste you do not even like. Diogenes was willing to break those invisible rules to test whether they were worth following. Sure, sometimes that meant doing things considered shocking, like eating in public or mocking important people, but it also meant refusing to participate in hypocrisy. And that is something we can use today, whether it is questioning the need for overcomplicated work processes, rejecting pointless status games, or challenging cultural norms that make us miserable. Finally, Diogenes reminds us to embrace self-sufficiency. He was not advocating for everyone to live in a jar and bark at strangers, but he was showing that the less dependent you are on external approval and external possessions, the more control you have over your own happiness. You can apply this without selling all your belongings by starting small. Try a Diogenes day, where you go without buying anything, without scrolling for validation, and without doing things just to impress people. See how it feels. You might be surprised at how much unnecessary noise you can cut from your life. Of course, Diogenes also had his flaws. He could be needlessly harsh, deliberately offensive, and completely uninterested in personal hygiene. If he were alive today, he would probably be banned from Twitter within a week. But the core of his message, that freedom comes from needing less, still hits hard. In a world where companies spend billions convincing you that you are incomplete without their product, Diogenes is like that one friend who looks you dead in the eye and says, "You are already enough, you just do not need all that extra junk." So next time you find yourself stressing about keeping up with trends, imagine Diogenes sitting in his jar, watching you with a smirk, ready to ask why you are working yourself into the ground to buy a thing that will be obsolete in 6 months. And maybe, just maybe, tell yourself that the best kind of wealth is the kind you cannot lose when your Wi-Fi goes down. Because at the end of the day, Diogenes did something most of us secretly dream about. He opted out of the nonsense, lived entirely on his own terms, and even managed to leave a mark on history without owning anything but his body and his mind. The man was proof that sometimes having nothing makes you richer than kings, and that is the genius of Diogenes the Cynic, the homeless philosopher who owned Alexander the Great. He showed that radical simplicity can cut through the absurdity of social conventions like a hot knife through overpriced organic butter, and that the truest form of power is needing so little that nobody can take it away from you. So, what do you think? Could you pull a Diogenes, ditch the stuff, and live free, or would you miss your Netflix password too much? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this trip into the weird, wonderful, and occasionally smelly world of ancient philosophy, hit that subscribe button for XQ, quick, funny explanations, where genius ideas meet ridiculous laughs at the speed of thought.